Hi, this is African Americans in the History of American Education by me, Brendon Minke. Before the Civil Rights Movement, uh, before the end of the Civil War, the enslaved African Americans were not allowed to be educated. This was because of the owners of the slaves were worried about the potential for an uprising from the slaves. Any slave that was caught reading or studying would be severely punished. However, there was such a desire from the slaves to educate themselves, so they did so in secrecy. After the Civil War had ended, many did not want African American and white children to be educated together. As a result, schools were segregated with whites only and blacks only schools. The states of the black schools compared to the white schools were abysmal. According to the article, The African American Struggle Through the U.S. Educational System, the lack of proper and fair financing for black learning institutions affected the quality of the education provided. Teachers could not give pupils ample individual attention, and therefore students were made to work exponentially harder in order to succeed. These newly freed people would gather wherever they could in order to obtain education, places like churches or, if they were lucky, schoolhouses. Many of the schools that did exist for the black children during this time were made possible by organizations in the North. According to the authors of Schools for Freed People, schools were sponsored by private aid societies and benevolent societies from the North, such as the American Missionary Association, the National Freedmen's Relief Association. Sabbath schools, night schools, and privately sponsored schools also taught freed people. Many of the blacks only schools would not exist if not due to private supporters from the North, because at this time the South was not open to the idea of educating the freed slaves. One of these sponsors was known as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. The NAACP played a pivotal role during this era and helped the success of the Civil Rights Movement. This organization has fought race-based discrimination and injustices since its founding in 1909. The mission of this organization was to achieve a fully integrated society with equal rights for all. Many of the accomplishments of the NAACP came from fighting the Jim Crow laws. The list of accomplishments include outlawing the grandfather clause that made it easier for white people to get around literacy tests in order to vote and make life harder for African Americans. Another accomplishment was how they brought awareness to the lynching of African Americans. And one last accomplishment was, and probably one of their greatest, was they successfully argued for the Brown versus Board of Education case. Without organizations such as the NAACP, it would have been more difficult for the colored people of this era, and the Civil Rights Movement may not have taken off as well as it had. Plessy versus Ferguson. This case arose from the Separate Car Act in Louisiana that required segregation of whites and African Americans on train cars. Homer Plessy sat in the whites-only compartment and refused to give up his seat. This led to his arrest, and while on trial, Plessy's lawyers had argued that the state law of the Separate Car Act had denied him his rights as stated by the 13th and 14th Amendment. These amendments provide equal treatment under the law for everyone. The judge, John Howard Ferguson, ruled that the state of Louisiana had the right to regulate railroads that operated within their state borders, and Plessy was convicted. This case was extremely important because, as told by a History.com article over the case, this established the doctrine of separate but equal. This allowed states to legally segregate the races in public spaces, and this paved a way for segregation of the races all the way until the ruling of the Brown versus Board Education in 1954. The Jim Crow laws lasted from the end of the Civil War up until 1968. The roots of the Jim Crow laws came from the strict laws of freed slaves called the Black Codes. These laws established strict guidelines for where and how freed slaves could work and for how much compensation. During the beginning of the 1880s, big cities in the South were not strictly enforcing the Jim Crow laws, and this led to a surge of African American populations to move into the big cities. As a result, however, the white Southerners began to demand for more laws in order to limit opportunities for their African American counterparts. Now, the expansion of the Jim Crow laws reached to the big cities, and African Americans were no longer able to enter the same public spaces as white people, and everywhere from restaurants to schools to theaters were segregated. Another landmark case during the Jim Crow era was the case of Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas in 1954. This case came about when an African American parent did not like the state of the facilities that the blacks only schools were in. So Oliver Brown decided to enroll his child into an all-white school because he saw how much better those facilities were. According to 13.org, Brown claimed that Topeka's racial segregation violated the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause because the city's black and white schools were not equal to each other and never could be. Despite Brown's claim, the federal district ruled that segregated schools were equal enough to be considered under the Plessy Doctrine. Brown then appealed this ruling to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court needed to look at if, in fact, the segregated schools were truly equal. After reviewing a psychological study of black girls in segregated schools, they found that these girls had low racial self-esteem, and the court ruled in favor of Brown. The Supreme Court had declared that racial segregation of children in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which states that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The court also declared for the integration of public schools in all the states. Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Earl Warren, was quoted to say, "Segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. The impact is greater when it has the sanction of the law, for the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. Any language in contrary defining this is rejected. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate education facilities are inherently unequal." Although this case was in 1954, the South did not reach widespread integration until the late 1960s and early 1970s due to heavy opposition of the ruling. The Civil Rights Movement was an incredible feat for those oppressed colored demographic of the United States of America. It not only provided African Americans equal treatment under the law and allowance into public spaces like theaters and parks, but also provided them with opportunities in education that they were not receiving before. Since the schools were forced to integrate, the opportunities of African Americans were beginning to be equal to that of the white people in this era. The textbooks were the same, the facilities were the same, and the access to good and free education was the same. Only through the strength and determination of some of the bravest was this incredible milestone able to be met.